Chapter 14, Eleanor and John. In the midst of her sorrow, Eleanor was faced with the most difficult political crisis of her life. To supporting and helping her unreliable and unpopular son John to take Richard's place as King of England, ruler of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. To try to mold John, noted for his treachery and evil acts, into a kingly character was challenge enough, but even more difficult would be keeping King Philip from snatching the Plantagenet lands from her weak son. She would have to act quickly, for there was another claimant to the English throne. Some people thought her little grandson, Arthur of Brittany, son of her dead older son, Geoffrey, had a better claim. But there was little to recommend Arthur, only a powerless 12-year-old, except the magic of his name, and Eleanor despised Arthur's mother, Constance, as much as Constance despised Eleanor, her mother-in-law, and all the Plantagenets. But the worst thing about Arthur was that he was already in the clutches of the crafty King Philip. Philip had taken the fatherless boy to Paris, where he was schooling him to hate his Uncle John and all his Plantagenet relatives, and leading Arthur to think he was the rightful heir to all their lands. Arthur was too young to realize that Philip was only using him for his own ends. To break the Plantagenet power, Eleanor could see that backing Arthur would simply be playing into the enemy's hands. John, a grown man, seemed the lesser of two evils. In any case, Richard had named him as his heir. That was enough for Eleanor, and for the faithful William Marshal, who set off to England to prepare John's coronation. Eleanor was now 77, but she didn't let her age or her sorrow hold her back. After making gifts to the Abbey of Fontevraud for the repose of my very dear Lord King Richard, and gifts to his trusted friends and servants, a bakehouse to one, a manor to his old governess, even a village to his valet, she was off on another political goodwill tour of Aquitaine to prepare it for the future. Through her generosity and understanding, she hoped to gain its lasting loyalty to her and its future duke, the new King John of England. She knew she could get better support for him without his presence. She went alone. It had been a long time since she had made a thorough tour of her own duchy, and she noticed many changes. Roads were better, the land seemed more lush and cultivated than ever, towns had grown bigger, new ones had sprung up. There was an air of prosperity despite some areas devastated by Richard and Philip's recent battles. As a young queen, Eleanor had never thought how the poor peasants and village folk suffered from warring knights who trampled their farms, burned their villages, and mercilessly killed anyone in their way. To the thoughtless nobles, war was a game. After flying at each other's throats, they often became friends again, wining and dining together, while the poor peasants either were dead or had lost everything. More than ever before, Eleanor saw the need for peace. She talked to merchants and artisans in the towns, and at their request granted charters giving the towns freedom to run their own governments. Some of her charters freed the townspeople from irksome obligations to their loyal overlords, from bridge tolls, demands for military service, and yearly gifts of their labor. But in return for these privileges, they would be responsible for defending their own towns. In Poitiers, which 60 years earlier she and Louis had punished so severely for daring to ask for freedom, she now granted a charter which gave it that freedom. She also granted families the right to choose husbands for their daughters without their lord's consent. The charter further specified that no citizen could be imprisoned except for murder, theft, or treachery. Eleanor may not have fully realized the benefit of her charters, that free citizens would take more pride in improving and defending their towns and maintaining order and increasing trade. Even though Eleanor had reached an age when many people tend to live in the past and to resist change, she was on the wave of the future. Kings would follow her example, seeing the advantage of granting freedom to towns in exchange for their support, and thus binding them more directly to the monarchy. Eleanor's trip took her as far south as Bordeaux, west to the Atlantic coast, and back north to the Loire Valley, almost 1,000 miles in 3 months of summer heat. Henry could hardly have done better. Reassured of Aquitaine's support by the success of her trip, Eleanor decided to fulfill a humiliating obligation in the furthest interest of peace. The further interest of peace, to pay homage to her overlord, King Philip, for all her lands. She knew the value of a vassal's oath, but it was especially odious to Eleanor to pay homage to the man who had deserted her son Richard on crusade, then plotted with John against him, and was even now plotting with her grandson Arthur against the new King John and herself. But swallowing her pride, she knelt before King Philip, young enough to be her son, and placed her old hands in his, giving him her vassal's oath of allegiance. Philip's one eye looked coldly at her as he gave her the customary kiss of peace, hateful to them both. By this act, Eleanor was once more recognized as Duchess of Aquitaine, its rightful ruler until she died, and the king was obliged to protect her, his vassal. She hoped that this gesture of peace would curb any schemes Philip might be hatching with Arthur to seize her lands south of the Loire River. Shortly after this, and only 5 months after Richard's death, Eleanor had another sorrow when her youngest daughter, Joanna, died. Her oldest daughter, Marie, had died the year before, Alix the year before that, and Matilda some 10 years earlier. Of her 10 children, only 2 remained, John and her namesake Eleanor, Queen of faraway Castile in Spain. Eleanor never seemed to have time to indulge her sorrows. Once more she was on the road, on one more errand of peace to carry out a marriage contract between a granddaughter and the new French prince. Her granddaughter would be marrying the grandson of her ex-husband, Louis. Whatever Eleanor thought of this combination, she hoped it would cement the new peace treaty between John and Philip. In early January of the year 1200, the dawn of a new century, Eleanor, now 78, set off with her escort along the pilgrim highway heading south to the pass of Roncesvalles, which led over the Pyrenees mountains to Spain. Winter's winds and sleet made the going difficult, but at the head of the pass was a welcome monastery where pilgrims and travelers found bed and rest. As they came down the pass, the mists lifted and the foothills of the Pyrenees opened to a welcoming plain where the going was easier. The mountains behind them now sparkled in Spain's brilliant sunshine. By the end of January, Eleanor arrived in Castile, where her daughter presided over a court as refined and cultivated as her own had been in Poitiers. Eleanor found her beautiful daughter, whom she had not seen for 30 years, surrounded by her 11 children. Eleanor was asked to choose among her eligible granddaughters the one she thought most suited to be the future Queen of France. She chose 12-year-old Blanche, in whom she sensed a strong, queenly character much like her own. Eleanor chose well. Blanche would prove to be a great queen of France and the mother of a great French king and saint, Louis IX. Eleanor stayed in Castile for 2 months, delighting in her family and feeling happily remote from the political controversy up north. Pleasant memories of her youth and her former court at Poitiers revived as she listened to troubadours sing of love, heard seductive Spanish music, and watched young couples dance the fandango. Then Eleanor and her granddaughter set off for the north, crossing the Pyrenees in the first flush of spring. The going was slow, as the roads were crowded with pilgrims heading toward their favorite shrines for Easter. They stopped in Bordeaux and stayed in Eleanor's old ducal palace. From a balcony, Eleanor could point out to Blanche the meadow across the river where Prince Louis and the French had pitched their tents when they had come 63 years before to fetch her as a bride. Few grandmothers had as much to tell a granddaughter as Eleanor, whose life had been so packed full of adventure. Eleanor and her granddaughter parted company in Fontreval, the old queen returning there to rest once more while little Blanche went north to meet her unknown future husband. No doubt Eleanor warned her granddaughter that she would find the ways of Paris different from those of Castile. Eleanor now felt that she had done all she could in the interests of peace and saving the Plantagenet realm. Though growing feebler, Eleanor was not idle. She continued to communicate with John, giving him valuable diplomatic advice, to which he sometimes paid attention.